On December 17, 2010, a 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor set himself on fire in front of a government building in the city of Sidi Bouzid. Mohamed Bouazizi had been selling fruits and vegetables from a cart since the age of 12 to support his widowed mother and 6 siblings. That morning, a municipal inspector confiscated his cart and slapped him across the face. He went to the governor's office to complain. Nobody would see him. He bought a can of gasoline, returned to the street, and ignited himself. The image traveled instantly. Within days, protests had spread across Tunisia. Within weeks, President Ben Ali had fled the country. Within months, governments had fallen in Egypt and Libya. The Arab Spring, the largest wave of political uprisings in the Middle East in a generation, was underway. The standard narrative of the Arab Spring emphasizes democracy, social media, and the courage of ordinary people confronting authoritarian governments. All of these are real. What the standard narrative rarely mentions is the price of bread. In the 12 months before Bouazizi set himself on fire, global wheat prices had risen by 70%. A drought in Russia, one of the world's largest wheat exporters, had caused Moscow to ban wheat exports in August 2010. The countries where the Arab Spring erupted were, without exception, major wheat importers. Egypt imported more than 60% of its wheat. Tunisia imported nearly half its supply. When prices spiked, these governments, which had long subsidized bread as a tool of social stability, could not maintain the subsidies. Bread prices rose. And when bread prices rise past a certain threshold in countries where the poorest families spend 40 to 50% of their income on food, people do not wait for the next election. Bouazizi didn't set himself on fire over wheat. He set himself on fire over dignity and over a life spent in precarity. But the conditions that made his act into a revolution, the economic desperation, the government's inability to absorb pressure, the masses of people with nothing left to lose, were shaped in large part by the price of grain. This has been true for most of human history. The price of bread is one of the most reliable predictors of political instability ever identified. Understanding why requires going back 10,000 years to a question that sounds simple. Why did humans decide to become farmers? Wheat is a grass. Specifically, it is a mutant grass, a hybrid produced through natural crossbreeding between wild grasses in the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land running from modern Iraq through Syria and into the eastern Mediterranean. The version humans domesticated, sometime around 10,000 BC, was einkorn, a small, hard grain with a protective husk that made it labor-intensive to process without deliberate effort. People in the region had been eating wild grasses for thousands of years before they began cultivating them deliberately. The move from occasionally harvesting wild wheat to systematically growing it was not, by most measures, an obvious upgrade. Early agricultural communities worked harder than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. They lived shorter lives. They suffered more nutritional deficiencies because grain-based diets are less varied than the broad-spectrum foraging diet they replaced. They were more vulnerable to drought and crop failure than mobile populations that could move toward food when one source failed. The archaeological record shows a measurable decline in average height and bone density in populations that transitioned to grain-based agriculture, a decline that persisted for generations after the transition was made. So why did farming spread? The answer that now has the most scholarly support is almost embarrassingly simple. Wheat allowed larger populations in fixed locations. Once you have a larger population in a fixed location, you have something that can be taxed, organized, conscripted, and governed. Agriculture didn't create civilization because it was better for the individuals doing the farming. It created civilization because it was better for whoever organized the people doing the farming. The first writing systems in Mesopotamia, the earliest records humanity has of itself, are not poetry, philosophy, or religious texts. They are grain inventories. Clay tablets recording how much wheat came into the storehouses and how much went out. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works we possess, uses bread and beer as the markers of becoming civilized. When the wild man in Kidu encounters grain and fermented drinks, he becomes human in the story's terms. The Sumerians understood something about themselves that we have largely stopped noticing. Their civilization was, at its operational foundation, a wheat management system. Everything else, the temples, the laws, the armies, the poetry, was downstream of the granary. Egypt built one of the longest-lasting states in human history, and it ran on wheat. The Nile's annual floods deposited rich silt across the floodplain with a regularity that made grain cultivation almost automatic. Farmers planted in the retreating floodwaters in autumn and harvested in spring before the next flood arrived. The pharaohs controlled the granaries, and controlling the granaries was controlling Egypt. Because in a desert civilization, the person who decided when and how much grain was distributed decided who lived and who did not. The biblical story of Joseph is, whatever its historical basis, an accurate description of how political power actually worked in the ancient Near East. Joseph rises to power by predicting 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and convincing Pharaoh to store the surplus, and thereby controlling who ate and who did not. The ability to predict, accumulate, and distribute grain was the original form of state authority. The first bureaucracies were grain bureaucracies. The first taxes were grain taxes. The first censuses counted people to know how many mouths the granaries had to feed and how many bodies were available to farm more grain. Rome understood this as well as Egypt had. At its peak, the city of Rome housed around 1 million people, most of them fed through a state grain dole that distributed free or subsidized bread to adult male citizens. The logistics required: grain fleets from North Africa and Egypt, warehouses along the Tiber, administrative apparatus to track distribution, consumed enormous state resources and generated enormous political power for whoever controlled them. Julius Caesar expanded the grain dole significantly as a political tool, understanding that feeding the urban population was as important as fielding legions. The system was called the annona, administered by a dedicated government office, and it ran with a precision that most modern welfare programs would envy. To be late with the grain supply was to invite riot. To be generous with it was to own the streets. The satirist Juvenal's phrase, bread and circuses, panem et circenses, captures the cynical mechanics of Roman governance with a precision that has not dated. Entertainment distracted, bread sustained. Take away either, and the compact between city and citizen collapsed. The phrase is often quoted as commentary on shallow politics. It is more accurately a description of how urban food distribution has always worked as a political instrument in every civilization that has tried it. When the Roman grain supply collapsed in the 5th century from climate shifts and the loss of North African provinces to Vandal invasion, the city shrank from 1 million inhabitants to perhaps 100,000 within a generation. The streets and forums that had been the most complex urban environment in the Western world fell into disuse as the grain that had sustained them stopped arriving. Every subsequent civilization that built itself on concentrated urban populations would rediscover this vulnerability in its own way. Medieval Europe discovered it generation after generation whenever harvest failed. Grain prices tracked political stability across medieval Europe almost perfectly. Good harvests produced social calm. Failed harvests produced food riots, peasant rebellions, and political instability. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed between 10 and 25% of the population in affected regions, and created the social fragility that the Black Death then exploited 3 decades later. Wheat was at the center of every one of these crises, not as a backdrop, but as the immediate cause. On the morning of October 5, 1789, a group of market women in Paris began marching through the streets, gathering others as they went. By the time they reached the city gates, they numbered in the thousands. They marched 12 miles in the rain to Versailles. They surrounded the palace, forced the royal family to receive a delegation, and eventually compelled the king and queen to return with them to Paris, effectively ending the monarchy's ability to govern independently of the capital's population. The March on Versailles is one of the iconic moments of the French Revolution. It is taught as a story about popular sovereignty, about ordinary people confronting royal power. What is usually mentioned only briefly is what the women were marching for: bread. The price of bread in Paris had risen to consume between 80 and 90% of a working family's income. People were not simply hungry. They were mathematically unable to survive on their wages at current bread prices. The French grain markets of 1789 were suffering from compounding failures. The harvest of 1788 had been poor across most of France, following a severe spring frost and summer hailstorms. The winter of 1788 to 1789 was the coldest in living memory. The price of a 4-pound loaf of bread in Paris rose from 8 sous in normal years to 14.5 sous by July 1789. A typical daily wage for a male laborer was 15 sous. The political philosophy of the Enlightenment gave the revolution its vocabulary. The price of bread gave it its fuel. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said, "Let them eat cake." The anecdote predates her by decades and was attributed to a different royal before being attached to her name. It has survived because it captures something real about the distance between those who governed and those who ate. The actual revolutionaries understood perfectly well what was driving events. Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety instituted grain price controls, the maximum, in 1793, partly because the revolution could not survive bread prices that prevented its supporters from eating. The guillotine and the grain dole were, in this sense, instruments of the same political project. Terror and bread distribution were both answers to the same question. How do you hold a population together when the supply chain that feeds it is failing? The revolutionary period established a pattern that European and then global governments would follow for 2 centuries: subsidize bread or face the consequences. The political logic is simple. When bread is affordable, people tolerate a great deal. When it is not, no amount of political legitimacy or military force provides reliable stability for long. This is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism, documented across cultures and centuries with a repetition that amounts to a law. The mechanism works on a specific timeline. Food price spikes typically take 6 to 9 months to translate into political instability, as households exhaust savings, reduce meals, and reach the point at which nothing remains to cut. This lag has been documented by researchers studying famines, food riots, and revolutions across the historical record. It was confirmed again in the Arab Spring. The Russian drought that caused the wheat price spike happened in the summer of 2010, and the governments fell in late 2010 and early 2011. Not immediately, after the savings ran out. By the 19th century, European agriculture had been pressing against a biological limit for 1,000 years. Wheat yields per acre had barely changed since Roman times. Farmers in England in 1800 were getting roughly the same harvest per acre that Roman farmers had gotten in Italy in 100 AD. The reason was nitrogen. Plants need nitrogen to build proteins and grow, and wheat is particularly hungry for it. Soil nitrogen is naturally replenished through the decomposition of organic matter and through the activity of bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen into forms plants can absorb. But these processes are slow, and in fields farmed year after year for grain, the natural nitrogen supply is depleted faster than it is restored. Traditional farming managed this through crop rotation, alternating grain with legumes, which fix nitrogen, and through animal manure. These methods worked, but they imposed a ceiling. You could not simply grow more wheat by wanting more wheat. The soil had limits that no amount of human will or political demand could override. By 1900, those limits were becoming visibly dangerous. The global population had reached 1.6 billion, double what it had been in 1800. The expansion of agriculture into new territory, North America, Argentina, Australia, had provided relief, but the frontier was closing. In 1898, William Crookes, a British chemist, delivered a presidential address to the British Association for the Advancement of Science that became famous in agricultural circles. He calculated that within 40 years, the world's wheat-growing capacity would be unable to feed its population unless a way was found to fix atmospheric nitrogen at industrial scale. They were arithmetic, not alarmist speculation. Crookes framed the challenge as a problem for chemists. A German Jewish chemist working in Karlsruhe took that framing seriously. Fritz Haber had spent years working on the problem of nitrogen fixation. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen gas, an effectively infinite supply of the element that agriculture most desperately needed. The problem was that atmospheric nitrogen is chemically inert. The two atoms in each molecule are bound so tightly that most living systems cannot access them. Certain bacteria can access atmospheric nitrogen, everything else cannot. Haber believed he could do chemically what the bacteria did biologically. In 1909, in collaboration with the industrial chemist Carl Bosch, Haber produced the first synthetic ammonia using high pressure, high temperature, and iron catalysts. The Haber-Bosch process could take nitrogen from the air and combine it with hydrogen to produce ammonia, convertible into the nitrate fertilizers that plants absorb. Commercial deployment of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer began before the First World War. The agricultural consequences, when they fully materialized, were transformative beyond any prior estimate. Nitrogen fertilizer eventually doubled and tripled wheat yields per acre in regions that had barely moved from Roman-era productivity in 1,000 years. Without the Haber-Bosch process, the Earth could sustainably feed a maximum of 4 billion people at current dietary patterns. The current global population is 8 billion. About half the nitrogen atoms in the proteins in every human body alive today came, directly or indirectly, through the Haber-Bosch process. Haber is responsible for more human lives than any other individual in history. Not an exaggeration, not a rhetorical flourish, a calculation that holds up under scrutiny. But Haber's story does not end with nitrogen, and this is where it becomes something that resists comfortable moral categories. When the First World War began in 1914, Haber redirected his expertise to the German war effort and became the principal architect of Germany's chemical weapons program. He supervised the first large-scale deployment of poison gas in warfare, the release of 168 tons of chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres on April 22, 1915. The gas killed an estimated 5,000 Allied soldiers and injured 10,000 more. Haber traveled to the Eastern Front to oversee subsequent deployments of increasingly lethal agents, and described himself, without apparent discomfort, as a servant of Germany, in war as in peace. Clara Immerwahr was his wife. She was herself a brilliant chemist, the first woman to receive a doctorate from the University of Breslau. She had spent years reconciling her scientific ambitions with a society that offered her husband a career and offered her a role as his assistant. She believed that his work on poison gas was a perversion of science and a crime against humanity. She argued with him repeatedly. He did not change course. The night of May 1st, 1915, shortly after Haber returned from overseeing the Ypres gas attack, Clara took his service pistol into their garden and shot herself. She died in the arms of their 12-year-old son. The following morning, Haber left for the Eastern Front to oversee further deployments. He received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918 for the nitrogen fixation work, while Allied governments were considering prosecuting him as a war criminal. He accepted the prize in a ceremony that his wife could not attend because she was dead. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, none of this history protected him. He was forced to flee Germany as a Jew. He died in exile in Basel in 1934 at 65, on his way to Palestine. Fritz Haber saved roughly 4 billion lives and helped develop the weapons technology that enabled industrialized atrocity. He is buried in a Basel cemetery. The world does not have a good category for him, and it has largely chosen not to try. The Haber-Bosch process he developed now consumes about 2% of the world's total energy supply and produces around 170 million tons of ammonia annually. That ammonia, converted to fertilizer, feeds half the global population. The nitrogen atoms it fixes move through the food chain into every human body on Earth. In a literal, chemical sense, Fritz Haber is inside you. The First World War established a pattern the 20th century would repeat with escalating efficiency, controlling grain as an instrument of political power. Britain's naval blockade of Germany was, in large part, a grain blockade. Germany had imported a considerable portion of its food before the war, and the blockade succeeded in reducing German caloric intake by around 30% over the course of the conflict. Estimates of civilian deaths from malnutrition and related causes in Germany and Austria-Hungary range from 400,000 to 700,000. The political conditions the blockade created, economic desperation, class resentment, a sense of national humiliation, fed directly into the instability of the Weimar Republic and the political environment that National Socialism exploited. Stalin's use of grain as an instrument of terror was more deliberate and more precisely documented. Soviet collectivization in the late 1920s and early 1930s dispossessed Ukrainian peasants of their grain in quantities that went beyond any possible agricultural or industrial rationale. In 1932 and 1933, Soviet authorities set grain quotas for Ukrainian villages that exceeded what the villages actually produced. Officials arrived to search homes, confiscate anything edible, and block access to markets or neighboring regions that might provide food. Families were found dead with grass in their stomachs. Children were found dead with clay in their mouths. The grain continued to be exported to Western markets throughout the famine. The Holodomor, Ukrainian for death by hunger, killed between 4 and 7 million people. It was not a famine in the conventional sense of crop failure and unavailable food. It was the deliberate removal of food from a population for political purposes, executed through the machinery of state grain management. The Ukrainian parliament now recognizes it as genocide, and the historical evidence that it was deliberately engineered rather than the accidental result of policy failures, is no longer seriously contested among specialists. Nazi Germany planned explicitly for grain as a mechanism of conquest. Generalplan Ost, the master plan for the occupied Eastern territories, projected that a substantial portion of the Slavic population would starve in order to free up agricultural land for German settlement and grain for German use. An estimated 4.2 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, the majority from starvation. The ideology of Lebensraum, living space in the East, was fundamentally a grain strategy. The conquest of Ukraine and Western Russia to secure the agricultural surplus that would sustain an expanding German empire. The most destructive war in human history was, in significant part, a war fought over wheat fields. The lesson governments drew from the 20th century was that grain supply was a strategic asset as important as military capacity. Every major power built national grain stockpiles. The United States, the Soviet Union, and China all treated grain production as a matter of national security. The era of global free trade in grain that had developed in the 19th century never fully recovered from the political lesson that food could be weaponized with more precision and less accountability than almost any other instrument of power. By the late 1940s, a different problem was becoming visible. The Haber-Bosch fertilizers were now widely available. Wheat fields, given ample synthetic nitrogen, grew taller and more densely than traditional varieties. Too tall and too dense. The heads of grain became too heavy for the stalks, which lodged, fell over in rain or wind, before harvest, destroying the crop. The nitrogen was doing what it was supposed to do. The wheat couldn't handle the resulting growth. Norman Borlaug was an American plant scientist from rural Iowa who had trained in plant pathology and ended up working in Mexico under the Rockefeller Foundation's Agricultural Development Program in the late 1940s. His assignment was to improve wheat yields for Mexican farmers. He spent years crossing thousands of wheat varieties, looking for plants that could absorb heavy nitrogen fertilization without lodging. The semi-dwarf varieties he eventually developed were shorter stalked, with sturdier stems and a fundamentally different allocation of the plant's energy, less directed into growing tall, more directed into producing grain. This was not a cosmetic change. It was a redesign of the plant's basic metabolic priorities, achieved through crossing the rust-resistant varieties he had bred with a Japanese dwarf variety called Norin-10 that carried the gene for short stature. When Borlaug took his seeds to India and Pakistan in the 1960s, both countries were experiencing food crises that some demographers projected could become catastrophic. India was importing 10 million tons of wheat annually, and appeared to be heading toward a famine that could kill hundreds of millions. Within a few years of adopting Borlaug's varieties, combined with the synthetic fertilizer and irrigation they required, India went from wheat importer to wheat exporter. The same transformation followed in Pakistan, in Mexico, in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. An estimated 1 billion people are alive today who would not have been born or who would have died in childhood without the agricultural transformation Borlaug's work made possible. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. He is, by the measure of human lives attributable to his work, possibly the most consequential individual of the 20th century. He is considerably less famous than dozens of people who accomplished incomparably less. The numbers in India are worth sitting with specifically. In 1965, India received the largest shipment of food aid in history from the United States, 10 million tons of wheat. The shipment came with a condition. The Indian government had to allow American officials to oversee its agricultural policy. By 1968, 3 years after Borlaug's varieties and methods were introduced at scale, India had produced a record wheat harvest and no longer needed the aid. By 1974, It had built grain reserves. The transformation in 1 decade was so complete that it changed not just food security, but India's negotiating position in the world. A country that cannot feed itself depends on whoever can. Borlaug was not naive about what he had accomplished. His Nobel acceptance speech in 1970 contained a warning that has been quoted for decades without sufficient attention to its actual content. He warned that the Green Revolution had won a temporary success, bought time. Population growth would eventually outrun it, if not accompanied by broader development. He did not think he had solved the food problem. He thought he had bought a generation to work on it. When asked about his legacy in a 2009 interview, at 95 years old, he said he was not confident the world would find the next agricultural revolution before it needed it. The Green Revolution's requirements were not optional accessories. Borlaug's semi-dwarf varieties needed synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to produce their extraordinary yields. They needed reliable irrigation at levels that traditional farming had not required. They needed pesticides and fungicides because their dense growth created conditions favorable to disease. They needed mechanization to harvest efficiently at scale. A farmer who adopted the seeds without access to Haber-Bosch fertilizer, reliable water, and chemical inputs didn't get Green Revolution yields. They got a short-stalked wheat variety that yielded less than the traditional variety they had replaced, with seeds they now had to buy rather than save. The Green Revolution fed 1 billion people and created a global food system that cannot function without fossil fuels. There is a fact about modern wheat that most people who eat bread every day do not know. It deserves considerably more public attention than it receives. Wild wheat, before domestication, existed in dozens of species with extensive genetic diversity. Early farmers cultivated many of those varieties, selecting for local conditions, seasonal patterns, soil types, and culinary preferences. Medieval European farmers grew hundreds of distinct local wheat varieties, each adapted to the specific microclimate of its region. As recently as the early 20th century, the genetic diversity of cultivated wheat was still considerable, not because farmers were preserving it intentionally, but because the decentralized nature of pre-industrial agriculture naturally maintained it. The Green Revolution changed this at speed. Borlaug's semi-dwarf varieties outcompeted traditional varieties so decisively that farmers around the world adopted them and abandoned what they had been growing for generations. By the late 20th century, a handful of high-yielding commercial varieties dominated wheat production across most of the planet. The genetic diversity of cultivated wheat was dramatically narrowed, not by accident, but by rational individual choices made by farmers and agricultural systems seeking maximum yield that collectively produced a global monoculture. The parallel to Ireland is direct. Ireland grew one variety of potato, a pathogen evolved to attack it, and 1 million people died. Modern wheat agriculture is a global monoculture orders of magnitude larger, and it faces an active pathogen threat. Wheat stem rust, Puccinia graminis, was largely controlled by Green Revolution varieties that carried specific resistance genes. In 1999, a new strain appeared in Uganda. Designated UG99, it overcame the resistance genes that had protected wheat for decades. It spread across East Africa and into the Middle East. Current estimates suggest that 90% of the world's wheat varieties are susceptible to UG99 or related strains. The disease has not yet reached the major wheat-producing regions of South Asia and North America. When it does, the consequences will be the largest test of global food security since the Green Revolution itself. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, built into a frozen mountain in the Norwegian Arctic, holds backup copies of more than 1.3 million seed samples from around the world, including extensive wheat collections representing varieties abandoned in commercial agriculture. Its purpose is exactly what it sounds like: insurance. If the varieties we depend on are destroyed by disease, climate change, or other catastrophe, the vault provides a library of alternatives. The vault is an acknowledgement that we have created a food system so dependent on a narrow genetic base that we needed a planetary backup. Then we built it in a mountain in the Arctic, because no more obviously secure location was available. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the military and humanitarian consequences dominated the coverage. The food security consequences received considerably less attention, despite being, for a significant portion of the world's most vulnerable populations, equally severe. Ukraine and Russia together export about 30% of the world's wheat, 20% of its corn, and 80% of its sunflower oil. Ukraine alone supplies a majority of the wheat imported by Egypt, the world's largest wheat importer, and large portions consumed in Lebanon, Somalia, Eritrea, and Sudan. When Russian naval forces blockaded Ukraine's Black Sea ports in the early weeks of the invasion, some 20 million tons of grain sat in Ukrainian silos, unable to be shipped, as global prices spiked to record levels. The human cost of that price spike was specific and documented. In Somalia, where families were already facing drought-related food insecurity, the wheat price shock pushed malnutrition rates into emergency territory. In Lebanon, where the 2020 Beirut port explosion had already destroyed the country's main grain storage facility, the combination of economic crisis and import price spikes produced bread queues that stretched for hours. In Egypt, the government spent billions in foreign exchange reserves to maintain subsidized bread prices, reserves it could not afford to spend and could not afford not to spend. The UN World Food Programme estimated that the number of people facing acute food insecurity globally rose from 276 million to 345 million between February and May 2022. That increase of 70 million people in 3 months was driven substantially by the wheat price shock. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by the UN and Turkey in July 2022, allowed Ukrainian grain to resume moving through a protected maritime corridor. Russia withdrew from the agreement in July 2023 and resumed naval pressure on Ukrainian shipping. The crisis recurred. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, with no role in the conflict and no ability to influence its outcome, found their food security deteriorating as a direct consequence of decisions made in Moscow. The geography of vulnerability had nothing to do with the geography of responsibility. This is, in precise historical terms, the same dynamic that has operated for 10,000 years. Control the grain, control the politics. The pharaohs understood this, and Stalin understood it better than anyone. The scale has changed. A war between 2 countries now produces food insecurity for 100 countries. But the mechanism is identical to the one that operated in Pharaoh's granaries. Whoever controls the wheat storehouse has power over whoever does not. And the farther that power extends, the more people live inside its shadow. Wheat is not tolerant of heat. Its critical growing phases, particularly the period of grain filling, when the plant converts photosynthate into the starch and protein in the grain, are sensitive to temperature spikes. The proteins that give bread its structure form only within a narrow temperature range. A few days of temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius during grain filling can reduce yields by 20 to 30% as pollen becomes non-viable and the grain fails to develop fully. Above 40 degrees, reproductive failure becomes likely. The plant evolved for the conditions of the Fertile Crescent. It did not evolve for the conditions that industrial civilization is creating. Every degree Celsius of global average warming reduces global wheat yields by approximately 6%. This is not a modeling projection. It is an observed relationship, documented through decades of yield data across multiple wheat-producing regions and confirmed across independent studies using different methodologies. The areas of the world best suited to wheat production are shifting poleward as temperatures rise, into regions whose soils are less suited to cultivation and whose infrastructure for large-scale grain agriculture does not exist. Across northern India, Pakistan, China, and the American Great Plains, the 4 regions that produce most of the world's wheat, significant heat stress is projected to arrive within the coming decades. These are not peripheral growing regions. They are the foundation of global wheat supply. In 2022, a heat wave arrived in northern India in March during the critical grain filling period and reduced wheat yields by an estimated 15% in affected regions. The Indian government responded with an export ban that contributed to the already stressed global wheat market, compounding the pressures from Ukraine. Indian agricultural scientists studying the event projected that heat stress episodes of this type will become more frequent, potentially reducing India's wheat production by 20 to 30% by mid-century. India has 1.4 billion people to feed. Borlaug bought time. The question the climate forces us to confront is what was done with that time. Humanity used it to build a population of 8 billion people and a food system that feeds them primarily on 3 or 4 crops. That system depends entirely on fossil fuel inputs, for the nitrogen fertilizer that wheat requires, for the fuel that powers the machinery, for the energy that runs the irrigation systems. Decarbonizing it without reducing its capacity is a challenge whose difficulty rivals the Green Revolution itself. The window that Borlaug opened is closing, and the preparations for what comes after it are not proceeding at the required pace. There are people working on the next agricultural revolution right now, developing wheat varieties that tolerate heat, require less nitrogen, and resist new rust strains. Genome editing tools are accelerating the development of new traits in ways that traditional breeding cannot match for speed. But it is proceeding at the pace of carefully funded scientific research, against a challenge that is accelerating faster than research institutions are funded to track. The gap between what is needed and what is funded is not small. A 2022 report by the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research estimated that adapting global food systems to climate change would require an additional $7 to $10 billion annually in agricultural research and development. Current annual investment in agricultural research globally is around $50 billion, a figure that sounds large until you consider that the global food system it underpins represents $8 trillion in annual economic activity. We are spending less than 0.5% of the value of the system on protecting the system. There is a line that runs from the first Mesopotamian grain inventory, a clay tablet recording how much wheat came into a storehouse in Uruk around 3200 BC, to the loaf of bread on your kitchen counter. It passes through Pharaoh's granaries and Roman grain ships and French bread riots and Fritz Haber's laboratory in Karlsruhe and Clara Immerwahr's garden and Norman Borlaug's Mexican wheat fields and the silos of Odessa and the seed vault in the Arctic. It is the longest continuous supply chain in human history, and it is, in the strictest possible sense, the supply chain on which civilization depends. Wheat is not like coffee or tea or sugar. You can decide, in principle, to stop drinking coffee. You cannot decide to stop eating wheat. If you live in a society built around it, and most human societies are. The global food system has been organized around wheat in ways that cannot be substituted without replacing not just one ingredient, but the entire infrastructure of production, storage, transportation, and preparation that has developed around it over 10,000 years. This is the dependency that Bouazizi's death illuminated. Not the obvious dependency, we need food to live, but the invisible one. The chain connecting a field in Ukraine to a bread price in Cairo has more links in it than any previous generation of humans had to worry about. Each link is a place where the price of grain shapes the stability of a government, and where that stability shapes the options available to a street vendor with nowhere left to turn. That chain has more links than any previous generation of humans had to worry about, because each link represents a point where efficiency was maximized and redundancy was removed. The system feeds more people than any previous food system in history. It fails less often. When it does fail, the failures are correspondingly larger. Food security researchers have a term for this: systemic risk. It means that the same system designed to eliminate the risk of famine, the global grain market, the high-yield varieties, the nitrogen fertilizers, the transportation networks, has become the risk. Not because it doesn't work, but because it works so well that we have built everything on top of it and removed the alternatives. The Irish, who ate nothing but potatoes in 1845, understood intuitively that depending on one crop was dangerous. They had no choice. We have choices, and we have organized the global food system to maximize yield and efficiency in ways that reproduce, at planetary scale, the vulnerability of an Irish potato field. Mohamed Bouazizi died on January 4, 2011, 18 days after setting himself on fire. He did not know that his act would bring down 4 governments and reshape a region. He knew that his cart had been taken, that no one in authority would listen, and that the arithmetic of his life had run out. The bread prices that shaped the conditions of his death were set in commodity markets in Chicago and London, responding to a Russian drought that no one in Sidi Bouzid had any power over. Fritz Haber died in a Basel hotel room in 1934, en route to Palestine, having been driven from the country he had served past the point of catastrophe. He had saved more lives than any person alive and supervised the killing of thousands. He had received a Nobel Prize while Allied governments considered prosecuting him. He had given humanity a tool that we have not learned to hold carefully. The process he developed still produces the nitrogen that grows the wheat that feeds 4 billion people. The weapons technology he pioneered still shapes the arsenals of every major military power on Earth. Norman Borlaug died in 2009 at 95, having spent 6 decades trying to stay ahead of the food problem. He fed 1 billion people. He bought time. He understood, with the clarity that long life and genuine expertise produce, that he had not solved the problem. He had changed its timeline. The semi-dwarf wheat he bred is still the dominant commercial variety in most of the world's major producing regions. The rust strains that his varieties could resist are evolving. The climate that his yield calculations assumed is changing. The grass domesticated in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago now covers more of the Earth's surface than any other crop. It feeds half the global population as a staple. Its price is tracked in every financial market in the world. Wars are fought over its supply, and governments fall when it becomes unaffordable. And the entire system that produces it rests on assumptions about climate stability, fossil fuel availability, political cooperation, and the continued vulnerability of the pathogens that attack it, that are all simultaneously under stress. That is not a reason for despair. Understanding what we have built and what it requires to keep working is the prerequisite for keeping it working. The people most likely to fail at that are the ones who have been told that the food system is somebody else's problem, a matter for farmers and scientists and governments, not for the people eating the bread. The Sumerians who first stored wheat in a government granary were solving the same problem we face, at a scale that was manageable and a consequence that was local. The problem has not changed. The scale and the consequence have. What we stand to lose if we do not solve it is not just food. It is the accumulated complexity of a civilization built over 10,000 years on the predictable availability of grain. The city itself, the density of people, ideas, institutions, and relationships that makes urban life what it is a wheat product. It exists because grain can be stored, transported, and distributed at scale in ways that berries and game cannot. Every library, every laboratory, every concert hall, every university is, at one remove, downstream of the Neolithic farmers who first decided to stay in one place and tend a grass. Losing the stability of that system would not just mean hunger. It would mean the contraction of everything that depends